Hello, and welcome to the Book Tapestry. When I first picked up Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, I honestly thought I was just settling into a beautifully atmospheric medieval murder mystery. But books have this habit of pulling the rug out from under you. One small detail opens a trapdoor, and suddenly you find yourself staring at digitized historical manuscripts from the Library of Congress at midnight, wondering how a 14th century villager even comprehended the Bible without a printing press. That rabbit hole led me to one deceptive question. What was life actually like inside a medieval abbey? Welcome back to the show. I'm Sophia Wordsmith, and this is episode 21. Today, we are looking into life inside a medieval abbey. We tend to look back at these stone structures through a romantic, almost static lens. We see them as quiet sanctuaries of peace, prayer, and whispered Latin. But as I mapped out the architecture of these institutions, I realized something far more profound. A medieval abbey was not merely a religious building. It was an entire civilization compressed into stone walls. It was an isolated socio-political ecosystem running its own highly specialized, self-contained operating system. I used to look at the medieval church as this single, massive, monolithic entity operating under pure corruption. But when you examine the raw historical documents, you discover that the truth is infinitely more complex. It wasn't just about greed. It was an active, high-stakes attempt to stabilize a fracturing world. Today, we are going to untangle the hidden code of that world, looking past the habit and the cowl, to see the intense friction between governance, absolute poverty, and the control of truth. To truly understand this world, we have to look at it the way a software engineer looks at overlapping networks. The medieval religious landscape wasn't a single hierarchy, it was two distinct, competing power systems running simultaneously. On the macro level, you have the standard church hierarchy: the Pope, the cardinals, the archbishops, and the regional bishops. This is the global administrative state. But on the micro level, running parallel to it, is the monastic structure: the abbot, the prior, the librarian, the monks, and the novices. Think of it like federal versus state governance, or even decentralized localized servers running on an entirely different source code than the central mainframe. The abbey possessed a fierce, localized autonomy, and at the absolute center of this localized server was the abbot. He wasn't just a gentle spiritual guide whispering encouraging words, he was a ruler in miniature. Under the ancient framework of the Rule of Saint Benedict, the abbot was the architect of order. He held absolute spiritual authority over moral conduct, but he also managed massive tracts of land, balanced the books, resolved legal disputes among the brothers, and negotiated high-stakes political treaties with outside nobles and papal envoys. A strong abbot maintained a delicate, razor-thin equilibrium between obedience, survival, and intellectual inquiry. But if an abbot was weak, the system would quietly fracture, politically, intellectually, and theologically. Let's zoom in on that internal monastic source code. It boils down to a single famous Latin phrase: ora et labora, pray and work. This core operating framework was engineered by Benedict of Nursia back in the 6th century, and it completely standardized Western monastic life. I was looking at an early 8th century manuscript of the Rule from Bavaria, digitized by the Library of Congress. Even though it was written in a Latin script that felt entirely foreign to look at, the structural intent was unmistakable. It was designed to eliminate comfort and self-expression, replacing them with absolute continuity, discipline, and devotion. Every single aspect of life was strictly scheduled. Monks would rise long before the sun to begin their prayers. They balanced this spiritual intensity with grueling manual labor, cleaning, cooking, tending the gardens, and manufacturing their own goods to maintain a completely self-sustainable ecosystem. But this raises an incredibly practical, systemic problem. If the medieval operating system relies on scripture, but books are handwritten, incredibly rare, and outrageously expensive to produce, how did ordinary people on the outside ever learn about God? They couldn't just open an app or read a family Bible. Literacy was a locked gate. The masses relied entirely on localized proxies, regional priests, wandering preachers, oral storytelling, and visual church rituals. Now, look at the systemic risk there. If the ordinary population is entirely dependent on oral transmission, then whoever controls the interpretation of the text holds absolute power over reality itself. If multiple, unvetted interpretations start spreading through wandering preachers, the entire societal framework begins to destabilize. That is why papal authority cared so desperately about orthodoxy. It's exactly why Brother William utters that chillingly precise warning in the novel. The simple cannot choose their personal heresy. They can only cling to whichever preacher happens to land in their village first. This brings us to the ultimate battleground of the novel, and of medieval history itself, the tension between preservation, inquiry, and what I call epistemological capture. In the name of the rose, these abstract philosophies collide through brilliantly realized characters. On one side, you have the intellectual framework of the great Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas believed in structured, disciplined inquiry. He didn't fear questions. He believed that rational observation and human intellect could step by step clarify a truth that already existed. Brother William of Baskerville stands right in this lineage, positioned intellectually between the rational discipline of Aquinas and the radical observation of William of Ockham. William doesn't rush towards certainty out of fear. He trusts the process of rational discovery. But inside Eco's fictional abbey, we meet the terrifying counterweight to inquiry, Jorge, the blind librarian. To understand Jorge, you have to understand that in the medieval world, the librarian was the ultimate gatekeeper. Today, we view libraries as open networks of free data. In the medieval world, the library was a vault of restriction. The librarian cataloged the manuscripts, supervised the scriptorium, and strictly decided who could access which text. Jorge doesn't outright reject a thinker like Aquinas. Instead, he does something far more dangerous. He appropriates him. He wraps himself in the language of flawless orthodoxy to filter reality and preemptively kill any question before it can even be formulated. He transforms the library into a mechanism of absolute censorship to protect the institution's ideological purity. This creates a brilliant, catastrophic inversion of power within the abbey. The abbot rules the visible world of physical behavior and daily chores, but the librarian rules the invisible world of knowledge, data, and interpretation. When you restrict data, the abbot's formal authority becomes totally dependent on a filtered reality. As Michel Foucault famously noted centuries later, knowledge and power are fundamentally intertwined, and once a gatekeeper convinces themselves that they are the sole, chosen protector of absolute truth, any metric of violence becomes entirely justifiable to preserve the order. This brings us to a profound, fundamental difference between how they viewed the world and how we view ours. Consider the figure of the novice, the young monk in training. In our modern educational systems, we encourage students and novices to question everything, to push boundaries, because we operate on the fundamental premise that questioning discovers new truth. But in the medieval monastery, a novice was seen as raw, unformed material to be reshaped through relentless repetition, discipline, and observation. They lived in a sort of spiritual panopticon where they were constantly seen, constantly corrected, and systematically stabilized. Why? Because to the medieval mind, the core purpose of education was not innovation, but preservation. Thinkers like Augustine of Hippo or Aquinas may welcome questions, but always guided them toward a truth that was already assumed to be absolute and unchangeable. So, under the medieval operating system, questioning does not discover truth. Questioning merely clarifies a given truth. When every novice begins to question the foundation of the code, the doctrine becomes negotiable, authority becomes relative, and the entire self-contained civilization fractures into chaos. The real fear wasn't the act of asking a question. It was the terrifying prospect of uncontrolled interpretation leading minds outside the institutional firewalls. When those firewalls failed, you got historical tragedies like Fra Dulcino, a radical reformer who took the Franciscan ideal of absolute poverty, broke away from the order, and cascaded into absolute violence, chaos, and eventual execution. Eco masterfully juxtaposes these lofty theological debates about poverty against the brutal, physical reality of the medieval poor. We see the nameless peasant girl exchanging her body just for a scrap of food to survive. It forces us to confront a brutal question. Can massive, wealthy institutions built around lofty spiritual ideals ever truly comprehend real, material suffering? When I closed the lab report on this investigation, I realized that the danger of epistemological capture isn't just an ancient medieval relic. We see it every day in our modern world. Whenever an organization allows internal silos to form, Whenever the data gatherers and tech gatekeepers hold more functional power than the formal leadership, reality gets quietly filtered. We still have librarians who restrict access to complex datasets under the comforting guise of protecting the established order. At the same time, I walked away from this research with a strange, unexpected envy. I don't subscribe to their theology, but there is something remarkably healthy about the physical rhythms of ora et labora, that deeply disciplined, self-sustaining balance of manual labor, structured study, and quiet meditation that stands in stark, healthy contrast to our hyper-fragmented, screen-saturated modern existence. We are only scratching the surface of these hidden institutional architectures. Next week, we are going to pivot deeper into medieval history and the intricate code of church systems. We'll be breaking down the macro level of the global church hierarchy alongside the micro level of the power structures running inside a local abbey. From there, we'll map out the competing operational philosophies of the major monastic orders, the Benedictines, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans. Because what makes Eco's work so brilliant is how it mirrors history. The massive, macro-political issues of an entire continent are staged and weaponized within the micro-environment of a single, isolated abbey. If you want to see the complete structural diagrams, the mapped hierarchies of the papacy versus the abbey, and the timeline of the Benedictine rules, head over to our website at thebooktapestry.com to explore our visual conceptual maps. Until next time, keep untangling the threads. Thank you for listening to The Book Tapestry. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend who prefers listening over reading. See you next time.